Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's event organized by the UBS International Center of Economic and Society. 3 days ago, at the University of Zurich, celebrated the 70th anniversary of Winston Churchill's historical speech on Europe that took place in this room. Churchill's main message was clear: let Europe rise, he proclaimed. He had the vision of a strong, united Europe without national boundaries, where people would travel without restrictions. 70 years after his speech, Europe is facing a period of crisis. Brexit, Eurozone crisis, debt crisis, refugee crisis, to name only a few aspects of the problems. In light of this difficult situation, we often ask ourselves, can Europe be saved? Tonight, we're very lucky to have among us a world-leading thinker who is a specialist on international trade, international finances, currency crisis, and much more. The speaker is Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman. As he hardly needs an introduction, let me say just a few words. Prior to his current appointment at the City University of New York, Paul was a professor at Yale, MIT, Stanford, and Princeton. He is a fellow of the Econometric Society, a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a member of the Group of 30. He has served as a consultant to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, as well as to a number of countries. Paul Krugman is the author of 27 books and more than 200 papers in professional journals and edited volumes, and his impact in the economic profession has been enormous. This is also reflected in the many prizes that he has received over the years, which most notably includes the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences that he received in 2008 for his work on new trade theory and new economic geography. Paul Krugman has not only been hugely influential in science, he is among the best known and most influential economists in the world and has written extensively for a broad audience. These days, he is best known to the general public as op-ed columnist for the New York Times. In recognition of his influence, the Washington Monthly called him the most important political columnist in America. So I guess we are now all eager to hear what he has to say about the current economic and political situation in Europe and the future of the Euro and the European Union. Paul, welcome again. It's an honor to have you here. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for coming. Thanks to the university for having me here. I realize the title here sounds both ominous and cosmic, and I am going to be a bit ominous, a little bit less cosmic, I think, than it appears. Let me say a few words just first about the relationship between someone like myself and Europe as an entity, as a project. Because there are, I think, some Americans, certainly the caricature in Europe is that Americans have no sense of what it's about, no sympathy. Even if you are in certain parts of Europe, you'll get people saying, oh, you only have these criticisms because you want to see Europe fail, which is not at all where I come from. I understand about the crucial importance of the European project. We would not have as relatively decent a world as we do were it not for that long process that began with the coal and steel agreement more than 65 years ago. This whole process of creating a more integrated Europe committed to democratic values has been absolutely crucial. I've seen it over the course of my own life. I've been involved with some countries where the role of Europe as an entity, Portugal after its coup in the mid-70s, has been absolutely critical. So I want to see this thing succeed. At the same time, if you're someone who comes from outside Europe, I think there's a little bit more ability to step outside the conventional wisdom, to step outside the forces of consensus that apply often within Europe. That was certainly true when it came to the creation of the euro as a common currency. There was a very sharp divide in the circa 1990, in the run-up to the Maastricht Treaty, when there was, it was very difficult for people who were part of Europe, who were associated with the Commission, who were in any sense part of that system, to raise any doubts about the march towards the single currency. Meanwhile, those of us, often with broadly similar political values, broadly similar, even broadly similar views about how economics works, who were on the other side of the Atlantic, had very sharp doubts. Were very concerned. We came at it from the perspective of optimum currency area theory, which is a widely accepted or certainly widely disseminated view about how you decide whether countries should share a currency, and Europe didn't seem to fit the criteria that approach suggested. And so there was a lot of criticism, and there was a lot of acrimony. In the end, of course, most of Europe pushed ahead, with the exception of a few places. Britain, probably because of the shared language, rather strongly influenced by US-centric doubts about the project. Sweden for its own special reasons, but by and large, and of course Switzerland because of its distancing in various ways. The single currency went ahead. And had we come to this talk a few years ago, I probably would have centered it on the issues of the single currency and the problems, the way in which optimum currency area theory has unfortunately been validated and maybe even proved to be excessively optimistic about that. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Just to say right now, yes, we've had a terrible, terrible problem once the great flow of capital into Southern Europe stopped and went into reverse. We've had terrible problems of adjustment that were even worse than pessimists imagined. On terms of the economics, I think that people like myself were not wrong. If anything, if we were wrong, it was that we understated just how bad it would be. Even pessimists never imagined anything quite as bad as what has happened to Greece. Where I will admit to having failed to appreciate European realities was the strength of the political commitment, and the cohesion, political cohesion of Europe has been very impressive up to date. But I will come back to those issues some at the end. Those are issues of individual countries within the system. They are important. At the opposite end, there are the seriously cosmic issues, the questions about threats to values, whether the whole notion of open democratic societies is under threat. And associated with that are all of these incredibly tense issues involving migration, refugees, all of which I know nothing more than anyone who reads the newspapers. So that I can't really give you any very insightful thoughts about that, except to say that that I did not see coming. I was a critic, a skeptic about the euro, but I was an enthusiastic supporter of the Single European Act. So that I've been somewhat shocked at all the troubles that have come, and I certainly didn't. I think I didn't see Brexit coming long in advance. I was actually not one of those people who was sure that the Brits would vote remain. I take polls seriously, and the polls were close, but I didn't see the issue arising. That came out of nowhere as far as I was concerned. So that's a place where I not only do I claim no expertise, but I think I can demonstrate that I have no expertise. So what I want to talk about mostly instead is a kind of middle range. The macroeconomics of Europe as a whole, mostly of the euro area as a whole, though I think it applies elsewhere. And the thing to say, the starting point for all of that is to say, look, we are incredibly still very much living in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. That crisis, well, actually, the financial side of it began in 2007. Often chronologies of the crisis begin in July 2007 when BNP Paribas had to close a couple of its funds, close withdrawals from a couple of its funds. That was the beginning of the Great Crisis. It turned into a global recession in early 2008. It turned into a full-blown panic in September 2008 with the fall of Lehman, and the severe recession went well into 2009, all of which no one, well, there were a few people who predicted it, but there were also people who predicted 5 other crises that didn't happen, so you've got to be a little bit careful about that. But we did not see that coming. But the real amazing thing about it is that it's not over, that we're no longer in a phase of acute crisis, but the hangover just goes on and on and on, or what appears to be the hangover. We used to speculate about how long we would be at 0 interest rates, and the answer for the United States now is essentially, although slightly uptick, but it's now, it's clearly going to hit at least 8 years. I think none of us actually imagined that you could go to negative interest rates. That's been a revelation, kind of interesting from my professorial point of view. That's really exciting and interesting, but I don't think it's all that consequential in real life. But we've maintained it clearly. We have not returned to any kind of normal conditions financially, and in other respects, we are. In many ways, we still have not recovered. Actually, everybody has GDP that is far lower than any projections that were made in circa 2007. And employment, in the United States at least, the unemployment rate is back down to more or less it was, but in Europe, of course, not at all. We've seen some improvement, but it's very modest. Okay, at this point, I think we need to stop blaming what happened on the excesses of the pre-crisis period. We need to say, whatever it was, it looks much more as if what was going on before 2008 was masking some longer-term problem. This shouldn't really come as a surprise because we've had a sort of dress rehearsal for all of this in the form of Japanese experience. There were, many of us, I was one of those people who looked at Japan in the 1990s and did not see the issue as being a demonstration of how hapless the Japanese were. There were many people who did that, who just looked at Japan and said, oh, this just shows you that Japan doesn't know what it's doing. I didn't see it that way. I saw Japan as being kind of like the rest of us, a big advanced economy with policymakers who were not ideal but weren't idiots, and with political stability and all of these. And if they could get caught in this long stagnation, deflationary trap, then it could happen to all of us. Actually, just an aside, I was at Princeton for 15 years. I was hired in 2000, I think in part because to join a small group of Japan warriors, people who actually did look at Japan and thought it was a possible omen for other economies. The group is now fully dispersed, but anyway, it was myself, it was Lars Svensson, who went back to Sweden and gave good advice that the Riksbank ignored. There's Mike Woodford, who's more of an insider economist, tremendously influential in macroeconomic thinking. And what was the fourth guy's name? Bernanke, Ben Bernanke. Don't know what happened to him. Anyway, so we all did see some of this coming, but what I think none of us really imagined then that Japan would still be fighting 16 years later to escape from that trap. And at this point, we really have to say that whatever is going on in Japan, it was not just the excesses of the bubble economy of the late 1980s, that there's some underlying long-term weakness that keeps them in that position. And we're starting to be having to reach that same conclusion about the rest of us. This is true to some extent in the United States, where, yes, we have finally gotten back to something that looks close to full employment, but only with very low interest rates. And it's not all clear what we do if something else goes wrong. But it's much more obviously true about Europe. And so if we look at the euro area, as you can see up here, unemployment has only made a partial backtrack, very far from a full recovery. What's remarkable about that is that this failure to fully recover is occurring despite extremely expansionary policies by normal standards. Oh, sorry, meant to say also, employment is not fully back, and inflation is consistently well below the ECB's target. Now, Europe has always had more of a anti-inflationary rhetoric than the United States. The United States has pretty fully adopted, at least verbally, a 2% symmetric inflation target. Europe, it's below but close to 2, and slight differences in the measure. But if we look at, this is consumer prices ex food, alcohol, and tobacco, and energy, which is more or less what we would call core inflation in the US. It's floating at around 0.8% now. That's a much better measure than the headline rate, which fluctuates a lot with oil prices. And it's staying there despite the fact that, at least under current management, the ECB has made it very clear that it wants to get it back up to 2, and it has not succeeded. So we have an economy that's stuck not in deflation, Japanese style, but in what the IMF calls lowflation, which turns out to be a problem on multiple levels, that is stuck with elevated unemployment and doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And this is all true despite, so I'm going to give you 3 measures of expansionary policies. This is one that is not often thought of in terms of expansionary policies, but it's actually hugely important in the European context. This is, by the way, another thing I got wrong, or I didn't fully understand. In 2011, 2012, the euro area was very close to complete collapse, with extremely high interest rates being paid by Italy and Spain. So Greece is one thing. Greece is very important in terms of the timing, in terms of being setting the tone, but in terms of economic size, Greece is it's about 3% of the euro area. It's about the same size. Well, this probably doesn't help you any, but for American audiences, I say it's about the same size as the economy of Greater Miami, right? It's a pretty small piece of the whole thing. But throw in Italy and Spain, and you're getting up to about 30% of the combined GDP of the euro area. So this was fatal. And the general perception, which I have to say I mostly shared until quite late in the game, was that this was a fundamental solvency issue, that markets were correctly concluding that they could never pay their debt. But fortunately, Paul de Grauw saved the euro area. A little help from Mario Draghi. Paul de Grauw, being an economist who was then at CEPS in Belgium, is now at the LSE, who said, no, look at this. The fiscal outlook for Spain is no worse than the fiscal outlook for Britain, in spite of all of this. What's happening is that these are countries that don't have their own currency, which means that they are potentially at risk of a liquidity crunch, just plain running out of cash, which then would have catastrophic repercussions and might lead to debt default. And all that, the situation would be radically better if only the ECB would step up and say, well, we will ensure that these countries don't run out of cash. We will be the lender of last resort to countries as well as to banks. And, well, in fact, the ECB has never actually done it. It just said, well, we are willing to. So Mario Draghi said 3 words, whatever it takes. And then after the fact, was able to get his board to agree in principle to outright monetary transactions, has never actually done it. One of the great fears that still remains is someday there might come a point when they actually have to deliver, and would they in fact be able to do it in practice? But the markets believed they would, and miraculously, the interest spreads went way, way down. It's a remarkable thing that at this point, this is the spread between the 10-year interest rate on Italian bonds and German bonds. So it's a measure of that premium, and there's still a spread, but it's not much. Actually, one of the interesting things about Europe is that everyone worries about debt, but almost everybody except Greece is now able to borrow at the lowest interest rates in history. This is striking for Italy, striking for Spain. It's even more striking for France, which has hypochondria on fiscal issues. They imagine that they have a fiscal problem when they are in fact able to borrow long term at about 20 basis points, 0.2% interest, long term. But anyway, the point I want to make now is that from the point of view of the aggregate monetary position of Europe, this is hugely expansionary. German interest rates were already low, but now interest rates throughout the rest of Europe are very low. And if you were talking to people at the ECB, as I was in 2013, they were saying, you understand that we've gotten a big boost, a big expansionary policy because of the success of whatever it takes, which they were right. And of course, that went along with Switzerland's contribution to the world of monetary policy, which was the discovery that interest rates can actually go negative. I'm now embarrassed for all the years that I said that interest rates can't go negative because obviously people will just hold cash. What was the oversight? Basically, I think I was not thinking about mice. Storing large amounts of cash does require that you protect them, from water, wind, fire, and rodents. And so it turns out that you can put interest rate. I'm still amazed that minus 0.75% is possible. That's really quite amazing. But anyway, so interest rates, but the point is that for the euro area, short-term interest rates are now significantly negative. And even long-term interest rates are negative out to astonishingly long maturities, even more so here. But let's just focus on that. So this is an extraordinarily expansionary monetary policy by any standard. And one more thing, although I've just been reading now commentary from various sources, people are saying, well, quantitative easing may be over as an idea, and they'll try different things. But in any case, there has been a dramatic expansion of monetary base, of the stuff that central banks control. Now, that's been true. That was originally true. The Bank of England and the Federal Reserve. People say they printed money, which is not actually true. They created lots of bank reserves, which is not at all the same thing as printing bills. And the number of bills in circulation hasn't gone up all that much, which is interesting actually. That happened a lot more in Japan, which pioneered this route, I think. But I think there are just institutional and cultural differences. Another aside, a Japanese friend tells me that the only consumer durable that sells well in Japan is safes. But anyway, but tremendous stuffing of reserves into banks one way or another. Europe was a little bit late in that game, but this is the euro area monetary base, and again, it's an enormous expansion. It's at this point, it's triple what it was before the crisis. And all of this has done not much. Certainly you're not seeing a runaway inflation. In fact, inflation is stubbornly below 1%. You're not seeing a really vigorous economic expansion. You saw some expansion, but not a whole lot. Not clear that it had anything to do with monetary policy, in fact. And an economy that is just consistently weak. So where is this coming from? Well, we have an old doctrine that an old concept that is making a comeback now, which is, it has one of those very unfortunate names which doesn't mean anything to most people, which is secular stagnation. The intellectual history here is, actually the concept goes back to 1939. I'll talk about that in a second. The modern reintroduction, well, here is where I get really annoyed. I did say something about it and was worrying that it might be making a comeback as an issue and even used the words, but I did so in a couple of really badly written, incomprehensible blog posts that no one knew what I was driving at. And then Larry Summers, another person you may have heard of, gave a stunningly clear, very forceful speech on the issue at the IMF in 2013. And so two things really annoy me: that first, he gets all the credit for reintroducing secular stagnation, and second, that he deserves it. Because I was helpless on that. So we've reintroduced the concept. Now, secular stagnation as a concept, what it means, it does not mean slow growth. You can have slow growth without it being this kind of issue. Britain had slow growth for a couple of decades after World War II. That didn't make it secular stagnation. What secular stagnation means is consistent problems not on supply, not in terms of the ability to produce, but in terms of getting the private sector to spend enough to fully employ the capacity you have. It means that even zero interest rates, or even slightly negative interest rates, are on average not enough to produce full employment. And that doesn't mean that you never have periods when the economy grows. Doesn't mean that you never have booms. You can have, particularly if you have a bubble, it can produce a period when people are feeling good and the economy is expanding. But the normal condition, the average condition, is one of continuing, at least mild depression, which is very problematic and means that if you are in that condition, first of all, you are always a little bit depressed, and second, when bad things happen, you have no easy response. You can't cut interest rates because they're already very low. You don't have the normal ways of dealing with bad events. For quite some time, it's been reasonable, pretty obvious to argue that Japan has faced that condition. In retrospect, the great asset bubble that preceded Japan's Japan's 2 lost decades it wasn't so much the legacy of that bubble. It turns out the bubble was covering over, it was masking the underlying weakness of the Japanese economy. And you can see that now. Japan is finding it very, very hard to exit deflation despite aggressive policies. And surely the overhang of debts from 1989 is not the problem now, but Japan is still there. Where did such things come from? Well, the original, there's our original secular stagnation paper. It was actually by Alvin Hansen, the economist who brought Keynes to America. The title focused on population growth. So he argued that the fact that population growth was stalling was the reason behind the persistence of the Great Depression, in effect. It was the reason why, despite New Deal programs, despite very low interest rates, the US seemed to slip very easily back into depression. Was he right? We never got a chance to really test it, because we had a very large program of fiscal stimulus, otherwise known as World War II. And that not only led to a lot of inflation, but also was followed by a great baby boom. And so the demographics turned much more favorable. So we will never know whether Alvin Hansen's concern about about secular stagnation was justified given what he knew then. We can, however, look at Japan. If you ask, why has Japan had so much trouble? Again, you really can't say it's the overhang of debt from the bubbles of the 1980s, nor can you say really that it's lack of technological progress. Japan has remained reasonably inventive. Their productivity has the period when they were rapidly converging, when productivity was rising faster than anyone else's. That ended a long time ago, but it hasn't fallen either. Japanese productivity relative to that of the United States or Western Europe has been about the same for several decades now. But where Japan really stands out is demography. If you like, Japan's underlying problem is a shortage of Japanese. The working age population has been declining since the late 1990s. It's now declining at an astonishing clip. It's just declining about 1.5% a year. They basically just have very low fertility, a cultural resistance to immigration, and so the overall population, I think, has just started to decline, but the point is that the people of working age are rapidly declining in numbers now, and that's why would that create a problem? I mean, that creates an obvious problem fiscally. Who's going to pay the taxes to pay for benefits for the elderly? But it also creates a problem of private investment. Why will investors, you don't need to build new houses since the number of families is shrinking. You don't need to build new factories and office parks. I mean, there will be some because things are always changing, but you have a declining number of workers. Why would you, where does the driver come from? That's always been a pretty good story about Japan. Unfortunately, the standard measure here, I would like it to be a little more like 20 to 64, but population from the ages of 15 to 64 for the Euro area, which is roughly, call that the working age population. It grew fairly rapidly, not at US rates, but it grew fairly rapidly, but Europe has low fertility. It has some immigration, but not that much, and as we're seeing, to talk about the cosmic subjects that are not the main center here, that has huge problems of its own. And sure enough, since approximately, since the late 2000s, European working age population growth has ended and turned slightly negative. In terms of the demography, Europe looks like Japan circa 1999 or 2000. You're seeing the same phenomenon happen here as there. Now, the United States, by the way, we have seen our working age population growth drop from about 1 to about 0.4. So the United States has its own version, although it's milder, but Europe is the most pressing example of this problem. Okay, so here we are with population growth not happening. You could still have plenty of investment demand if you had really dramatic, visible technological change that necessitated a lot of investment. So if someone would come along and invent the economic equivalent of railroads or something like that, that would be great. But in fact, we're not seeing that, and technology, as best we can tell, measurement issues, but it does look as if productivity growth as measured has slowed down dramatically everywhere. I guess I'm of the school that says this is not really a policy issue, it's just, we just aren't having really great ideas. There's a favorite quote of mine from a really horrible person, but anyway, the entrepreneur Peter Thiel said, we were promised flying cars, and instead we got 140 characters. And so what that's saying is it's an environment which is hard to generate private spending, and I think we need to think of it that way. We need to say that in the United States as well, but much more so within Europe, the engines of demand have really slowed down. They're just not driving things the way they used to, leaving you with a really big problem. Okay, what would you argue should be the answer? Well, first of all, we don't know how long this goes on, and we know that we're in a world where monetary policy has a hard time gaining traction. In fact, has lost traction. One thing you could do would be fiscal policy. That's fiscal expansion. No matter how low interest rates are, it seems, you can't get the private sector to invest enough, but why not have the public sector invest? Why not go out there and build, do roads and bridges? And incidentally, Japan has been, one of the things they've done, so they entered something that looks like secular stagnation in the mid-1990s. They have kept their economy afloat with huge public work spending, which has led to ever-rising government debt, and people keep on forecasting a debt crisis for Japan, or they used to keep on forecasting it. In the financial world, the shorting Japanese government bonds has come to be known as the widowmaker, because people who invest always end up losing money, losing their shirts, and I don't know if anyone has actually committed suicide over losing money on, by shorting JGBs, but it's the story anyway. The fact is it has never turned to a crisis, and meanwhile, although Japan has had a long, compared with perceptions of Japan circa 1990, it's been disappointing. Things have not been too bad. Japan has sustained its relatively decent employment, has sustained a reasonable social environment. But they've done that with large-scale deficit spending over a sustained period. Well, I used to be, as I say, although I thought that the Japanese were a warning for all of us, I used to still be very critical of them for not doing what needed to be done. And I've kind of changed my view on that, simply not because they look any better, but because the rest of us have done so much worse. That Japan now looks almost like a role model instead of a cautionary tale. In fact, I proposed that the original Princeton group that from 2000 that we should all go to Tokyo and apologize to the emperor, but didn't get much response from my colleagues. Anyway, Europe has not done that at all. Europe did have some mild, so this is the primary balance, so not including interest rates, doesn't matter that much, adjusted. It's an estimate of what the budget balance would be if economies were at full employment. You can make, there comes questions about this. My guess is actually that Europe is in bigger surplus than this says, because the way that the international agencies do this, I think, anyway, doesn't matter. The main point is this: after a moderate amount of stimulus in the heat of the crisis, along came the Greek crisis, and then everyone in Europe turned to austerity. It became the religion that the European problems were supposed to have been caused by public debt, which never made sense for anybody except Greece. But it became the conventional view, and this huge push towards more austerity, so that Europe is, even as the underlying motors of European growth have slowed down, and the case for public spending to support it has become stronger. Europe has moved towards greater surpluses, towards more contractionary policy, exactly the opposite of what you might guess would be the right answer. Now, you might say, this can't go on forever, which is probably true. A program of maintaining full employment with public spending can't go on forever, although in Japan, we're now at more than 20 years, so that's a pretty long time. And there's another reason. There's a way you could make this sustainable, which I'll get to in a few minutes. But the point is that Europe has utterly failed to do anything effective on the fiscal side. The United States, by the way, has also had its own. We have not done wonderfully here either, and for somewhat different reasons. To some extent, an ideology of budget balance, but I think in large part just our own political division. In our case, nothing that I'm saying would meet with angry denials from the economists in the Obama administration, or with economists who are close to Hillary Clinton if she ends up winning. But we have an opposition party that, because of the US political system, is able to block any kind of tax or spending initiative, and which has done so. And partly, I don't think out of true concern about budget deficits, but just because if Obama's for it, they're against it. But anyway, that's I guess I do want to say, although I'm focusing this talk on Europe's problems, I'm not in any sense holding up the United States as a wonderful model of how to do things. It has often seemed to me since 2008 that we're kind of a competition between the US and Europe as to who can mess this thing up worse. You're winning, but not through lack of effort on the part of my own country. Anyway. Why has this European thing happened? What you notice very obviously is that now it does come back in part to the euro. The euro creates a tremendous asymmetry in constraints and incentives. Basically, countries in deficit, countries that have debts, are forced to contract. They have, of course, they have no monetary policy, but also it's difficult. They can't easily go ahead. They don't now pay very high interest rates, but their ability to borrow at reasonable interest rates depends on the implicit backing of the ECB, which means that they're in a very weak position to do anything different. There have even been cases where it's been more or less explicit that the ECB will yank support for your banks if you don't go ahead with an austerity program. And the result is this tremendous asymmetry. So this is just showing the same measure, but for Greece, which of course plunged into deficit. I don't actually think there was a loosening of fiscal policy very much, but I think that's a quirk of the measures. But just the point is that Greece is forced into actually awesome, huge fiscal austerity. The contraction there is on a scale that no one has ever seen before. Where Germany, which certainly has no need to be austere, but in fact Germany has shown no inclination at all to move in the opposite direction. This is partly the constraints posed by the system. It's also the complete absence of an automatic transfer mechanism. In the United States, if you look at when a state plunges into an idiosyncratic recession, one that is deeper than that of the nation as a whole, automatically it pays less in money to Washington, automatically it receives more. I actually did this for Florida, which in many ways looks like Spain in terms of the underlying dynamics. And at the worst of it, in 2010, Florida, between paying less in taxes, receiving more payments for unemployment insurance and health care for the poor, Medicaid, unemployment compensation, Florida was in effect receiving aid from Washington of 4% of its GDP. Not loans, but aid. And of course, you try to imagine in the European system, if you had asked, asked the German public, will you support giving Greece aid of 4% of its, it's just not, would have been unthinkable. And it probably would have been unthinkable if you had asked the citizens of New Jersey to give aid to Greece on that scale, but they weren't asked. It was just the way the system worked. So the system is inherently asymmetric. Why is, aside from weak growth, why is low inflation possibly shading eventually into deflation? Why is it such a problem? A couple of reasons, some of which are special, some of which are general, apply to everyone. Debt is not at the core of the crisis, I think, but debt is a problem. And every place where either governments or actually more important now households are in debt, low inflation means that the lower than expected inflation means that the real value of debt is worse. Low inflation also means that you can't get interest rates, you can't get real interest rates as low as you would like. So Switzerland has a nominal interest rate of minus 0.75, but it also has no inflation, which means that the real interest rate is probably, depends on what people expect, but still it's probably around minus 0.75. The US has a nominal interest rate of 0.25, but it has roughly 2% inflation. So our real interest rate is actually minus 1.75. In terms of what matters, US interest rates are lower than Swiss interest rates, despite the fact that the headline number is higher. So that's a big problem if you have an economy that tends to be persistently depressed. You can't get real interest rates as low as you would want. But then there's one more issue, which involves adjustment within Europe. So now I get back to the reasons why ugly Anglo-Saxons like me were skeptical about the euro, which turns out to have been only one piece of the reasons why we should have been skeptical. But our biggest concern was what happens if there's an idiosyncratic slump in some part of Europe. What happens if there's an asymmetric shock? And as it turns out, we had the mother of all asymmetric shocks, because all of that money flowed into Southern Europe after the creation of the euro and then decided to get out starting in 2009. So, but it could have been all kinds of things. And not only, actually, I should say, asymmetric shocks can happen to all kinds of countries for all kinds of reasons. Right now, if you look at the decline in per capita GDP since the beginning of the crisis, the worst country is, of course, Greece, which is in a class of its own. The second worst country is Finland. And nobody thinks the Finns were irresponsible or anything like that. The Finns just a small country which had the bad luck that their two great export sectors were Nokia and paper. And technology both killed Nokia and meant reduced demand for paper. And so there they are. So it can happen to us. So what has to happen? When that happens, a country needs to make itself more competitive. Needs to cut wages relative to its trading partners so that it can it can develop new export industries. And you can do that, you can do it through actual wage cuts, which are very, very slow and hard to do. And also mean, by the way, that the burden of debt gets greater. Or if you have your own currency, you can simply let the currency drop. So Iceland had a 50% gain in competitiveness basically in one day because it still had the krona. Obviously, no member of the Eurozone could do that. Now, is this really true? Maybe we're just imagining. Before the crisis, you could argue that worries that it was hard to cut wages were misplaced, that with structural reforms, labor markets, whatever, you could do that if necessary. Well, we have really pretty clear evidence. So I have a now favorite figure, which is actually courtesy of Olivier Blanchard, former chief economist of the IMF, and like everybody, a classmate of mine from grad school. He has the distribution among workers of wage changes in 2 years. The one at the left, and it's for Portugal, which is a good case because it's had a really severe downturn. In 1984, it was kind of bell-shaped, except even then, there were a bunch of workers for whom that little spike at the left is workers for whom the wage was no change. And that was because it's very hard to cut wages. Employers are reluctant to do it because the workers get demoralized. Workers are reluctant to accept it. 0 is a very important number when it comes to wage changes. And then, of course, you have 2012, which is a terrible year when really wages, in some sense, the market clearing wage in Portugal would have fallen a lot. And basically, for almost everybody, wages were 0, which is showing you that it's really, really hard to cut wages. And an adjustment, a system that requires that you adjust through wage cuts is very, very hard. However, if you have ongoing inflation so that the parts that are doing well actually have wages that are rising and rising at a fairly rapid clip, then you don't have to cut wages, or you can get a lot of adjustment just by not having wage increases. You can become more competitive. Now that works even in Europe as currently constituted slowly. Spain is the poster child for sort of success. After all this time, Spain has managed to its wages have fallen, not really fallen in euro terms, but fallen relative to those of Germany, so that Spain's auto industry is now bigger than Germany's, which is okay, but it's still not enough to stop them from having very high unemployment. But this is a really big problem, which means that Europe certainly should at least have the 2% inflation that was supposed to be the target. And I would say that 2% inflation target became conventional wisdom in an environment that was very, very different from anything we see today. And people thought it was enough, and now it looks like it really wasn't. It should have been higher. Okay, so can Europe be saved? Now, I don't see instant collapse. I don't see that out there. I mean, the political cohesion, again, has been awesome. If you had told me what Greece would look like now and asked to predict the political consequences, I would have said, first of all, they will have left the euro. Secondly, they would be governed by Golden Dawn. And in fact, neither of those is true. So the willingness to stay with the European project is immense. In fact, what's odd is that the places where the European project seems to be falling apart are often not the ones that are in worse shape. So you have Brexit, which the economic argument was not really compelling, but somehow there it happened. We have democratic values basically gone in Hungary and going in Poland, and at risk in Austria, which is really bizarre if you think that economics is what drives these things. So, so there are ways that Europe could collapse that in a way have nothing to do with all of this, but all right. But still, so how could we exit all of this? Well, it's actually pretty easy, conceptually, right? So first of all, you make me dictator. You make me dictator the way the ancient Romans did. 1 year to do whatever I want. Actually, I think I need 2, but anyway, give me a 2-year dictatorship. And then what I implement is a very aggressive form of Abenomics in Japan. More aggressive than the actual Abenomics, which has fallen short. So you combine a temporary but big fiscal stimulus with very accommodative monetary policy, and you do it until the inflation rate is well above current levels. I would go for 4, but 3 might do it. And then, after that, you're able to, through ordinary monetary policy, to maintain more or less full employment. It's not going to make adjustment easy. It's not going to solve the erosion of democratic values, and it's certainly not going to do anything about refugee crisis or any of that. So I'll hope that someone else has a brilliant idea there. But that's how you would do it. It would basically be something like what Japan has been trying to do, but with more force. So in that sense, can Europe be saved from this? Well, yeah. It's actually not even, I think the answer is reasonably clear how to do it. Okay. How is this going to happen? Well, we just go to the German electorate and say, look, here's our plan. You guys will have a big increase in spending, mostly coming from your country running up more debt, and okay. It's politically, wow, I don't quite see it. It's very hard to imagine, but at least I think it's important to be clear about it. Alternatively, we wait for something to turn up. I mean, at the moment, that's essentially the policy. The policy is waiting for something good to happen somehow. Maybe along comes that technology that generates a boom. Not a great strategy. And there is this erosion. I think what we worry about now is not an explosion. I'm inventing this on the spot. Not an explosion, but an erosion. A gradual reduction in commitment to the European project, gradual reduction in the commitment to the values underlying that project, probably drift of more and more unpleasant and fundamentally anti-democratic forces gaining traction because there's a general sourness about the whole thing. Of course, none of these things are unique to Europe. God knows. I mean, I'm a New York Times columnist, which means I cannot do political endorsements, so you have no idea who I favor in our election. But no, but obviously the clear and present danger is actually on my side. But if we get through that, I think we're structurally better equipped to deal with these things. And so maybe I should say, can Europe be saved? Yeah. Will it be saved? I sort of have my doubts. Thank you. All right.
So thank you very much for this great presentation and thought-provoking ideas. We have the opportunity to get some questions from the audience. So there are microphones around, and there is already one here.
Right up far front.
Keep asking and they will see you. Huh?
Yes, thank you. I'm from a very big Dutch national newspaper. And basically, I would like to ask you two questions, but it's probably not possible.
Probably just one, I think, to be fair.
So my question would be, do you think expansionary fiscal policy is actually going to work if we have a financial sector that is undercapitalized, that doesn't have enough capital?
Oh, yes, I don't see... I mean, the financial sector has some problems, but I don't... remember, what you're doing is you're creating more safe assets. You're creating more stuff that banks can hold, and if you like, it's hard to see why this creates a problem of leverage. It would be one thing if you were calling on banks to undertake risky lending, but we're not. And for what it's worth, also, the European, the austerity experiment, where some countries were forced into drastic austerity and others were not, has given us probably the best evidence we've ever had about the effects of fiscal policy, which turn out to be exactly as an old-line Keynesian would have predicted. So no, there's really no reason to believe that it wouldn't work. Oh, and Germany actually should be undertaking the expansion, also the Netherlands, by the way, which is sort of like Germany, only more so. And Germany doesn't have a problem here. I mean, there are individual banks, but it doesn't have a problem recapitalizing its banks if it wants to, and that would be helpful on multiple fronts. Anyway, I don't think that's an issue.
During your presentation, you didn't mention inequality. What do you think is the role of inequality in the European problem?
Okay. Yeah. This is a long-standing, interesting debate. How much do we think that inequality has been central to all of these things? Even though I think inequality is a huge social and political problem, and of course it's a big economic problem for the people who are at the bottom, I'm of the camp that says that it's not very central to the macroeconomic story. It's just hard to tell that story. We don't have a, it's just not the case that people with, that countries that have high inequality have higher savings than countries that have low inequality. Look at the United States. It's not the case even that countries with high inequality tend to have higher household debt, which was one possible channel, but if you start to look at the data, it's just not true. Some of the highest levels of household debt out there are in the Nordic countries. So I just don't, I mean, I think that's a different issue. It colors everything else. You can't really understand, I think more in the United States, but maybe in ways I don't fully understand here. In the United States, inequality is both a cause of and a result of our political paralysis, but that's a rather different story.
Thank you. I observe more and more that in Europe the euro area is fragmenting. That you have a nationalization of banks and you have hidden capital controls. And I think my scenario is that in about 10 years, you still have the euro, but it's completely fragmented into different monetary areas. Nobody is exiting, but basically like in the 30s in Eastern Europe, you're completely kind of autark in monetary respect. Do you think this is a realistic scenario?
It's certainly possible. And although I would say that of the various things that I would consider, I mean, this would not be a good thing, but it's not. It's certainly a second order compared to high unemployment and all of that. What is interesting is that to the extent you see this, one of the kind of puzzles is you see countries that very much just, you see countries impose capital controls, but preserve the euro, and which is they're getting the bad part of a euro exit without the good. You know, Cyprus had capital controls but no devaluation. Greece had capital controls but no devaluation. It's really kind of strange. And you know, this is a totally minor thing. But we used to talk about the possibility that the euro would start to seriously rival the dollar as a global currency, which is one of those issues that is much less important than people imagine. But that's been put on indefinite hold because there is certainly in the bond market, there is no euro bond market. There's a German market and an Italian market. So yeah, I mean, Europe, the euro in many ways, and this is one of the ways, although I don't think the most important, the euro is making Europe in important ways less united rather than more.
I have two questions, and I understand you will probably skip the second one, so I ask first, where could Germany do more given the refugee crisis and the problems which come upon Germany? And the second question would be, how do you feel about the looming US elections?
Okay. I'll answer the second one first. Nervous. Very, very nervous. No expertise. The polling guys, the New York Times polling experts, and the prediction markets, they actually more or less agree, say it's about 75% odds of Clinton. And given the alternatives, that is not high enough. Okay. I'm sorry, Germany, the question was what? Refugee crisis, yes. Well, no, I mean, Germany has so far been a relatively good actor, certainly compared with my own country, which has been ghastly on this issue. Now the financial burden is one that is not really a problem at all. In fact, it's even possibly a benefit. I mean, it's one of those things where spending money in this way is a fiscal expansion through a peculiar back door. But but of course, people are concerned. It's nervous. You know, we're getting into very deep cultural anxieties here, and so it's a plus. Of course, one of those very sad things. The world is not a just place. Angela Merkel is. I've had nothing but positive political payoff to her role in championing destructive austerity, and is now in great trouble for trying to do something which is actually the right thing to do. So I guess that's how things go. And all I can say is really we did not need this. I mean, with all of the economic issues, this thing comes on top, and of course. Just to make things perfect, the frontline state in the refugee crisis is none other than Greece. So possible conclusion is that God hates Europe.
You gave your recipe of Abenomics on steroids, so to say, to save the monetary union. After that, do you think that a fiscal union with fixed transfer mechanisms is absolutely needed for the monetary union to be able to survive long term? And if so, how tight will that fiscal union have to be?
Okay, so those are good questions to which I really don't know the answer. It's certainly hard to run a monetary union without a fiscal union. It works, it stumbles, it's very awkward. I have so far been surprised by the political cohesion, basically by the willingness of countries that are having to experience internal devaluation, they're having to experience long grinding unemployment, their willingness to stay with the currency union, which suggests that maybe Europe can stumble along even without the transfer mechanism. But it would clearly be better if it were there. So the trouble, I think, it is hard to envision. I mean, I would say a banking union, a true banking union with shared deposit insurance, that is almost, first of all, that should be easier, and it's almost a prerequisite for long-term survival. The other things become much harder. I mean, the U.S. transfer union is built essentially on social insurance programs. And anything that social insurance programs, even if they aren't designed as aid programs, even if they aren't explicitly means tested, end up being substantial transfers from richer regions to poorer regions. And given the sheer inequality among European nations, anything like, just try to imagine, if you set up a European retirement system, something like US Social Security, does this mean that Greeks are getting German-level pensions, something like German-level pensions paid for out of a common budget? And how are you possibly going to sell that? I mean, in the US it happens, in fact. If you take a look, we have wealthy states like Connecticut or New Jersey pay far more into the federal budget than they receive, and states like Mississippi receive far more. And of course, those are the ones who vote against big government, even as they are massive beneficiaries of it. They're for anyway. But U.S. inequality levels are much smaller than within the European Union. So I don't know. I mean, I'm for it, but I don't think it's. I don't see how it happens anytime. I don't expect to see it in my lifetime, basically. That's easier because I'm 63, so my lifetime isn't going on all that long, right?
Yeah, so small to medium enterprises make up a lot of the job hiring in countries like Italy and Spain. What do you think? Is it a good idea if the European Commission and the Europe, they introduce subsidies or easier loans to new entrepreneurs and some of the smaller companies so they can grow their workforce?
I don't have strong views on this. I mean, I've never been, I'm kind of instinctively skeptical of the SME mystique, but it doesn't mean it's entirely wrong. But mostly, though, I would just say the best thing is to just provide a favorable overall macro environment, and yeah, not violently opposed to it, but just not where I think the priority should be.
You just said that it's not that important, but anyway, I would like to have your opinion about the currency exchange policy of countries like Switzerland or the UK.
Oh, okay. No, I mean, about the currency exchange policies. No, I mean, those are, look, the UK, I still think they should put a statue of Gordon Brown in Trafalgar Square for keeping them out of the euro. Not so much because the devaluation of the pound, it turns out, was helpful, though there was some in the early stages of the crisis, but because it's meant that Britain has never faced these financial constraints. The British interest rates have stayed low all along. And actually right now, I'm not sure if you can quite imagine Brexit while being on the euro, but if there had been, the disruptions would be vastly more than they are now. I mean, there was a cushion, if you like, from the drop in the pound. Switzerland is an interesting case because Switzerland, in some ways, is financial markets love you too much, and so Switzerland has actually been on the receiving end of the problem, with a currency that wants to be too strong, and that creates all sorts of problems. But you have much more flexibility in dealing with it, and than if you had joined the euro. So even here, I think over the longer haul, it's still a good thing. I mean, it's very, very hard sharing a currency without sharing a bunch of other stuff. Common central government, common banking regulation, and frankly, just a sense of political unity is very hard to do. Not, I always, yeah, I mean, I was extremely skeptical about the euro from the beginning, and have not felt that I was wrong, given subsequent events.
So thank you very much, Paul, for this great intervention. It has been a great honor to be here with you. And I would like to thank everybody for attending this event. And I wish you all a pleasant evening and look forward to welcoming you again at one of our future events.